In part 1 of this documentary series, we explored the rebirth of an anti-slavery movement in Britain in the 1820s, an organisation set up to bring about an end to the institution of slavery across the British Empire. Yet they knew from the outset how difficult a task it would be to emancipate the enslaved populations. To do this, they would have to lobby for an abolition bill in Parliament and secure a majority of votes in both houses for any legislation. The trouble with this was the fact that Parliament remained a hotbed of conservative members of the West India interest, men who supported the institution of slavery and held vested interests in upholding it. In many ways, abolitionists faced a near impossible task. They had to convince well-connected and powerful MPs, many of whom owned property in the West Indies and indeed slaves, to terminate the very foundation of their fortunes. It would take some time, but in 1833, Britain would abolish slavery in its dominions. But how was the seemingly impossible achieved? And what events led up to one of the most significant pieces of legislation in British history? In the early 19th century, soon after Britain had abolished the slave trade, the nation's appetite for slave-grown commodities, such as sugar, showed no real signs of diminishing. All social classes were now consuming sugar frequently. It was this commerce, the trade in sugar, that had benefited so many in the metropole and financed the British Treasury in the form of taxation and import duties. It funded industrialisation, numerous commercial projects, and provided the capital for investment. West Indian proprietors continued to increase the scale of their production and exports to Britain. It was evident that the Abolition Act of 1807, which had outlawed the slave trade, had not hindered their ability to do this. In fact, overall production of sugar from the British West Indies rose considerably after the Napoleonic Wars. Unfortunately for planters, however, this sheer scale of production, at least by the 1820s and early 1830s, was beginning to exceed Britain's demand. Proprietors in the West Indies continued to increase production in this period, not because demand was continuing to grow exponentially, but because the price of sugar had fallen dramatically. According to one planter, the price of sugar had fallen from £3 per hundredweight in 1814 to 22 shillings per hundredweight in 1831. This dramatic fall in price was forcing planters to try and achieve economies of scale by increasing production to the extent at which they could still maintain the levels of profit they had enjoyed in the early 19th century. You see, at this point, many planters, as entrepreneurial as they may have considered themselves, were not at all attuned with the founding principles of microeconomics. Judging by the emancipation debates of the 1830s, proprietors were well aware that due to an excess supply of the commodity, a sugar glut now existed in the colonies. But this did not stop them from continuing to increase exportation. In tune with the natural laws of supply and demand, by exporting excess sugar back to Britain, they were themselves causing the price of the commodity to fall even further. The lower the price, the more they exported. And so, a vicious cycle developed. Those in the West India interest were either blind to or simply in denial of this fact. In their eyes, it was the increased competition from abroad that was to blame for the lowering of sugar prices and their dwindling economic prosperity. Newly established crown colonies such as British Guiana, alongside foreign colonies such as Cuba and Brazil, both of which still had access to the slave trade, achieved lower production costs and undercut the price of West Indian sugar within the European market. This well-acknowledged fact infuriated planters and pro-slavery MPs even more so, with talks of emancipation looming. It would be grossly hypocritical, they claimed, for those who promoted free trade to wish for emancipation while simultaneously purchasing cheaper, slave-grown sugar. But this was an era in which ideas of free trade were overtaking the old established system of monopolistic privilege. Arguably encouraging the West Indian planters to overproduce was the exclusive monopoly they had on the British sugar market. Sugar producers from the West Indies continued to be protected in the home market by a differential duty against foreign producers.
This monopolistic privilege was now not only damaging the Caribbean colonies, it was no longer working for the British consumer.
Questions over the value of the West Indian colonies were beginning to be raised as early as 1823 by the anti-slavery activist Zachary Macaulay. In a pamphlet published that year, Macaulay asked the British public to take into account not simply the amount of our West Indian trade, but the amount of what it costs us to maintain it, and the amount of what we lose by the preference we give to them over other parts of the empire. The monopolistic privilege granted to Caribbean planters, according to Macaulay, cost British consumers an excess of £1.5 million annually, as they were forced to pay over and above the free market price of sugar.
It was not just British consumers who found themselves at a loss. The colonial monopoly was now becoming a burden on the domestic manufacturers, those who owned and ran the sugar refineries here in Sugar House Island. The sugar refining industry in particular suffered extensively from the protective tariffs that were imposed on foreign sugar, obliging them to purchase the higher priced West Indian equivalent. This was increasing their production costs and hazarding the saleability of their refined sugar in the European markets.
Sir William Clay, who became MP for Tower Hamlets in 1832, argued that sugar refiners within Britain were now overwhelmed with ruin from no other cause than being compelled to use only sugar which was produced in the British colonies. And so, as Macaulay stated, instead of being a source of wealth to Britain, the West Indian colonies were now a dead weight upon it, a source of enormous expense without any adequate return. The first pillar upholding the institution of slavery was slowly withering away. Notions of free trade were on the rise, and so were notions of free labour. The rise of laissez-faire in the early 19th century and the notion of free trade became firmly entwined with the abolitionist proposals for emancipation and calls for free labour to replace slave labour. According to the revolutionary economist Adam Smith, slavery was not only morally objectionable, but also economically defective. As with the calls to abolish the home market monopoly, abolitionists had been arguing for many years that emancipated slaves could produce tropical staples more efficiently and cheaper than slave labour.
One of the arguments that some abolitionists make, is to do not really with enslaved people and the conditions in which they labour, but it's to do with British consumers and the price of sugar, essentially. And there's an argument amongst some abolitionists that free labour will produce sugar more abundantly and profitably than slave labour. And so that's one line that abolitionists take, is an economic argument for abolition.
Central to these claims was the idea that a healthier and more natural relationship existed between free labour and wealth creation. Emancipated workers would be committed within the capitalist model to the individualistic desire for self-improvement and advancement in society. Within the parliamentary debates, Edward Stanley would expand upon these sentiments. The colonial secretary exclaimed, contrary to the common belief of the West India interest, that slaves were not destitute of that spring of ambition which belonged to other people, that they were desirous, like others, of rising in the world.
Slaveholders, of course, continue to argue that their institution is profitable and economically important to Britain, that these colonies are part and parcel, essentially, of the wider British imperial economy, and that they pay dividends to Britain. One of the arguments that abolitionists come back against that with is that they believe, based often on ideas that derive from Adam Smith's thinking, that free labour ought to be more profitable and productive than slave labour. So their argument is that these colonies, valuable British possessions, will be more productive British possessions with a free labour regime rather than a slave labour regime.
Here, Adam Smith's revolutionary ideology had significantly bolstered the anti-slavery campaign, with the colonies now becoming more of a burden on the metropole as opposed to its greatest source of wealth. Abolitionists were able to incorporate these capitalistic values within their argument. Tried and tested in the East Indies, free labour was simply more efficient and was likely to be the only way in which planters would be able to escape the economic sinkhole that they were in. Central also to this argument was the idea that slave labour was becoming more and more unstable and that free labour was a safer alternative. Planters disagreed with this, of course, but it would be increasingly difficult to challenge this proposition after the events which occurred in Jamaica over Christmas in 1831.
On Christmas Day, 1831, many of the sugarcane fields across the island of Jamaica were empty. Over 60,000 enslaved workers had intentionally chosen this day, when a large majority of proprietors had travelled to the towns and cities to strike. Their demands? Simply a working wage. Within a few days, however, this protest would evolve into a full-scale, violent insurrection.
The Christmas Rebellion, which took place in Jamaica at the end of 1831, was a protest against slavery by enslaved people, and it's a protest against the system by those people on their own terms. And essentially what happened is, in the western part of Jamaica, particularly the parish of St James, large numbers of enslaved people, we're talking about thousands of people, refused to work. They put down their tools. In most instances, they left their home property, usually a sugar estate, but other properties are involved as well, and they refused to comply with their masters.
At the heart of what would be the largest rebellion in the West Indies since the revolution in Saint-Domingue were a few key figures and communities. Firstly, and most importantly, were the missionary community. Now, these were made up of Baptist and Methodist preachers who came over from England to bring Christianity to the enslaved populations. Now, this group, as we'll later go on to find out, were almost solely blamed by the planters for instigating the Jamaican Rebellion. Yet, despite the long distrust that existed between Anglican proprietors and the nonconformist missionary community, it was highly unlikely that any Baptist or Methodist preacher would openly prompt rebellious activity. It would go against what they were told and instructed to do by the London Missionary Society, and also it would put their own lives in serious danger.
Yet whilst it may be true that missionaries came to the West Indian colonies with instructions to promote obedience, this did not prevent slaves from seeing within the doctrine of spiritual equality sanctions for political discontent, and missionaries were well aware of this.
Enslaved people in the rebellion also make use of the networks that are provided for them by the Baptist Mission Church. So one of the things that has happened in the early 19th century in Jamaica is that large numbers of nonconformist missionaries have arrived in the colonies with the aim and intention of converting enslaved people to Christianity. Many of them Methodists or Wesleyans, but large numbers of them also Baptists. And the leaders of the rebellion in 1831, which gets called the Baptist War, are many of them members of this Baptist mission church. Some of them are even leaders, deacons within that organisation. So they use that structure, which allows them access to enslaved congregations in different parts of the island, for example, or different parts of the parish, to organise the protest that they have planned.
It came as no surprise then that the leader of the rebellion was an enslaved Baptist preacher. His name, Samuel Sharp. Sharp may have been enslaved, but he was also literate and well educated. He was a well-respected and well-spoken deacon, in charge of a missionary chapel in Montego Bay. Inspired by the nonconformist missionaries who had travelled to the West Indies, Sharp was not blind to the inherent contradictions that existed within the horrific institution. Despite attempts by planters to use the Bible to support slavery, there was far more evidence within the Holy Book to suggest that it was an immoral practice.
Enslaved people, like the leader of this rebellion, Sam Sharp, we know, used some of the ideas that they derived from mission teaching to help to inform their own politics of anti-slavery. So they used some of the teachings of Baptist missionaries to help shape their thoughts and ideas about how the institution of slavery should be opposed. So, for example, the idea that no man can serve two masters is used as rhetoric by these enslaved people, putting to their own uses the ideas that come from this white missionary group.
What originally was planned to be a peaceful strike soon turned into a bloody uprising. Missionaries such as William Knibb pleaded with the enslaved population to stop rioting, but at this point it was far too late, and understandably so. For many slaves, this was their one and only opportunity to escape the horrific institution.
Between the 25th of December 1831 and the 4th of January 1832, up to 60,000 enslaved people across 300 estates on the island burnt down buildings and warehouses full of sugarcane.
One of the things that the enslaved rebels do, which we know from their actions, is focus their attention on property, and particularly on buildings, and on those parts of the estates that are especially associated with their exploitation. So, for instance, at the centre of every estate there is a mill for grinding the sugar cane, and then other buildings that are associated with processing that cane. This is the sugar that they spend all year farming in the fields and then hauling to the mill to be processed for the profit of their masters. And so they attack those parts of the estate, and those are really expensive pieces of machinery and pieces of real estate, and they cost a great deal when they're destroyed. So this is one of the things that happens in the rebellion, particularly using fire to attack those parts of the sugar estates.
The rebels had timed their action well, when many planters resided in the towns for Christmas. When the terrifying news had finally reached them, the island's militia, made up of planters, merchants, shopkeepers and other white colonists, attempted to repel the violent mob, but they were overwhelmingly outnumbered.
Some groups of enslaved people confront the white militia in the interior of St James Parish, and there is a big fight between enslaved insurgents and the militia at one particular plantation called Montpellier. And this is how the rebellion begins. Essentially, it's a mass strike by the majority of the enslaved people that take part. But there's also these confrontations that take place between some groups of armed slaves and local white militiamen.
After numerous failed attempts to resist the rebels, and desperate to avoid total anarchy and collapse, the colonial government called upon Sir Willoughby Cotton, the commanding officer of British forces in Jamaica, and a veteran of Wellington's campaigns in Spain and Belgium. Cotton arrived in northern Jamaica with 2 companies of the 84th Regiment and an arsenal ready for war.
For many slaves, the arrival of the king's troops was enough of an indication that their dream was over and left them little choice but to return to work.
For numerous rebels, however, they had reached the point of no return. They continued to pillage across estates on the island, damaging hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of property, crops and assets. It was upon these rebellious slaves that the most ferocious crackdown and backlash was directed.
So the rebellion is a really big and important event, but it's very quickly suppressed once British troops arrive in the district of Western Jamaica in January of 1832. And this leads to an end to that mass strike, and those troops with the militia then sweep into the countryside and begin to defeat and capture some of the more die-hard rebel leaders.
The rebellion caused over £1 million worth of damage across 300 estates, close to 100 million in today's money. With damaged property, 14 white colonists dead, the island was now under martial law.
So it's an event that's very big, but it's also an event that ends fairly soon and with immense cost to those enslaved people who took the decision to rebel. So we know that about 200 enslaved people were killed during the suppression of the rebellion, many of them killed in cold blood during the fighting or after the fighting, and that 300 or more were executed after really hastily convened courts-martial after the rebellion. So more than 500 enslaved people lose their lives as a result of the rebellion, many of them in extremely grisly fashion. And although this is a rebellion that's taking place in the 1830s, many of the sorts of things that we associate with 18th century slave rebellions, including enslaved people who'd been executed having their heads placed on pikes as a warning to others, is a feature of the aftermath, the brutal aftermath to this uprising.
Sam Sharp was one of those condemned to death by rope. He was hung in Market Square, Montego Bay, on the 23rd of May 1832. Yet even the execution of the rebellion leader did not quench all white planters' thirst for revenge.
For many proprietors, capital punishment was in no way sufficient retribution for what had happened. Once initial fears were overcome and the immediate uncertainty of the uprising had passed, planters smelt blood. They relished the opportunities that the uprising had presented to settle old scores of missionaries and repress the enslaved population.
The first response of white slaveholders in the district of the rebellion is to vent their fury against enslaved people, and we see that with the mass killings that take place. But quite soon after, they turn their attention to the missionaries. They blame the missionaries for starting the rebellion. To the slaveholders, their view of the world is such that they can't bring themselves to believe that enslaved people were capable of organising such a large-scale event, and they decide that it must have been the nonconformist missionaries, the preachers, who put them up to it somehow. And they begin to attack mission churches, they destroy mission churches and chapels, they physically attack and abuse white missionaries. Some of them are forced to leave the island. So there's an organisation that begins to emerge in this aftermath that they call the Colonial Church Union, which is organised around the Anglican Church, and it's not a particularly Christian organisation, and in many respects, in fact, it's the opposite. It's an anti-Christian organisation that is venting this fury against non-conformist missionaries. But it goes under the flag of a colonial church union because it's really difficult for slaveholders to argue that they're against Christianity per se. What they argue is that it's the non-conformists, the Baptists and the Wesleyans that are the problem.
Just after it had grown dark, we heard the trampling of many feet and the sound of many voices approaching. I went to the window and saw by the light of the moon a large body of men at the gate, probably from 80 to 100. They forced me back with violence to the other side of the room, cursing me as a preaching villain.
But this means a great deal of antagonism and violence directed against white missionaries, who of course then go back to Britain and tell their stories. And that is an important part of the debate that leads up to the Abolition Bill in 1833, of missionaries going back to Britain. The most famous is a character called William Knibb, and telling true stories about the horrific scenes that they've witnessed in Jamaica. Now, some of those scenes are the torture and execution of enslaved people, but they also tell of their own experience of churchmen, men of God, being attacked and abused by white slaveholders in Jamaica. And this has a really strong effect on British public opinion. It's one of the things that really helps to turn that public opinion against the slaveholders in these last months before the Emancipation Bill.
The testimonies of missionaries such as William Knibb highlighted the bloodthirsty nature and the pent-up frustration of those who formed the Colonial Church Union. It was not a good look for the planter class, whose reputation, character and identity had already been questioned by those across the Atlantic for quite some time.
In a sense, the West Indian planters had shot themselves in the foot. The rebellion, albeit a reminder of the instability in the colonies, could actually have served as sufficient enough evidence that the enslaved populations were not quite ready for emancipation. But the brutal backlash that followed the rebellion and the charred ruins of the former Baptist chapels made people in the metropole view the uprising in a very different light. The Colonial Church Union was declared illegal by royal proclamation in 1832, and the second pillar upholding the institution of slavery, that being the image of the West Indian planter as a loyal and patriotic servant of the British Empire, was in tatters.
In 1828, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was 58 years old. He was greyer, thinner, and increasingly deaf, but he had retained the patrician bearing and self-confidence with which he once bestrode the battlefields of Europe. Since Lord Grenville's Ministry of All Talents had abolished the slave trade in 1807, the Tory party had not failed once to win an election up until this point. There had been quite a selection of Tory Prime Ministers in that time, however, due to internal fractures in the party and the ill health of those such as George Canning, who died as Prime Minister in 1827, and the ill fortune of Spencer Perceval, who became the first and only Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to be assassinated.
After Canning's death and the failure of Viscount Goderich to bring together Canning's fragile coalition of moderate Tories and Whigs, King George IV turned to the only man he thought could steady the ship. That, of course, being the Duke of Wellington.
Arthur Wellesley had experience in government, but he was in no way a conventional politician. What he was, though, much to the delight of the West India interest, was a man extremely hostile to any slight mention of reform, whether that be parliamentary, religious or colonial. He was, alongside his most trusted lieutenant Robert Peel, adamantly opposed to the prospect of emancipation in the West Indian colonies, and would become one of the anti-slavery society's fiercest critics. From his speeches in the House to his private papers, we have ample evidence of Wellesley's intentions to protect the interests of the planter class and curtail any propositions of amelioration or emancipation. It would be more wonderful to behold, he declared, the progress already made, than to express any strong censure for what remained to be done. The Prime Minister made it very clear that he was satisfied with the progress of amelioration in the colonies thus far, and that he would disregard any propositions or instructions for the colonial governments. We have no more the power of governing these colonies by force, he said, than we have of governing this country by force.
This was a bitter blow for the abolitionists, who yet again felt any momentum for their cause slowly slipping away. The Duke had made it very clear from the start that he had no intention of taking further steps to ameliorate the conditions of the enslaved populations in the West Indies, other than falsely exemplifying those measures already put in place.
The Anti-Slavery Society could be sure of one thing. No emancipation bill would ever be passed with a Tory government in power, especially in such an unreformed parliament as that which existed in the 1820s, where pro-slavery lobbyists could effectively purchase seats in the House. All seemed lost, yet little did the abolitionists realise, after years of bad luck and concrete opposition, that good fortune was on its way. After 23 years in government, the fractures within the Tory party were quickly becoming detrimental to Wellington's administration. They had lost significant ground to the Whigs in the 1830 general election, called in direct response to the death of King George IV. Within the context of public unrest and rioting, the Duke's combined advocacy of Catholic emancipation and his deep-rooted hostility toward parliamentary reform caused a significant split within his party, and as a result, on the 15th of November 1830, he lost a vote of no confidence and submitted his resignation. This left England's new monarch, King William IV, little choice but to ask Lord Grey, leader of the opposition, the Whig Party, to form a new government.
Earl Grey, previously known as Lord Howick, was the polar opposite of the Duke. He was an advocate of reform, both in Britain and in the West Indies. He was a leading voice in Parliament during the fight for the abolition of the slave trade, and he, perhaps more than anyone, understood the need to be pragmatic in his approach toward emancipation.
One of the key changes that takes place that allows for an abolition bill in 1833, amongst several, is a change of government. And just as in 1807, where there are Whigs in power, albeit briefly at that point, again, after a long period of Tory government, which has tended to be more sympathetic to planters and particularly to the more gradualist abolitionist arguments. By the 1830s, there's a new Whig government, much more open to the idea of emancipation and prepared to introduce the ending of slavery as part of a raft of reforming measures.
First on the agenda for Grey was reform. By 1830, this issue was at the heart of the British public's psyche and maintained the basis upon which the electorate would vote in upcoming elections. It was one of the main reasons Wellington was forced to resign, and it would be the reason the Whigs would soon control and later dominate the House of Commons. After the Duke lost a vote of no confidence and Earl Grey was officially asked to form a government by the King, plans were immediately made to draft a reform bill to present in Parliament. There was no doubt that reform was needed and long overdue, not to mention its importance in paving the way for emancipation.
To truly understand the significance of reform in the story of abolition, it's important we consider how the archaic system allowed the West India interest to maintain such a presence and stronghold in Parliament, despite not having the popular support and financial prowess it once boasted. The electoral franchise had not been extended since the 15th century. Now, this meant that the distribution of parliamentary seats was hideously imbalanced, and that the moneyed and landed classes were able to secure dozens of rotten and pocket boroughs. These were easy pickings for the West India interest.
In simple terms, a rotten borough was a constituency in the United Kingdom which had an extremely small electorate and hence could be used by a patron to gain unrepresentative influence within the unreformed House of Commons. Many such rotten boroughs were controlled by landowners and peers who might give the seats in Parliament to their like-minded friends or relations. They were also commonly sold for money or other favours. This patronage was based on property rights which could be inherited and passed on to heirs or else sold.
To put this into perspective, let's take the constituency of Gatton in Surrey. Now, this had a total of 7 voters and yet was represented by 2 parliamentary MPs. Now, if we compare that with the industrial centres of Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham with a combined total population of 750,000, these places were represented by a grand total of 0 MPs.
In an attempt to eradicate this corruption, the first Reform Bill was presented to the Commons by Lord John Russell in March 1831 and made it through to a second reading. Despite the vote attracting a record 608 members, it was only approved by a margin of 1 vote. It seemed pushback was inevitable. It was unfortunately at the committee stage that the bill truly hit a brick wall. Isaac Gascoigne, the Liverpool MP who had by no coincidence spent 35 years defending slavery, put forward a motion opposing the bill. This was carried against the government's wishes by 8 votes.
It was at this point that Earl Grey dissolved Parliament and called for a general election. He knew that the electorate was generally in favour of reform and that achieving a larger majority in the House may be the only way of passing the Reform Bill.
It was never really even a gamble. In May and June, voters went to the polls in an effective referendum on reform. A landslide victory for the Whigs resulted, who now commanded a majority of over 130 seats.
This result was monumental. With a large majority, the Whigs were now able to pass a reform bill. They now had the numbers where it mattered.
There would, of course, be stumbles along the way. The second bill did not pass through the House of Lords, but resulting violent public riots gave even those vehemently opposed to reform no choice in the matter. The third bill was introduced in December 1831, around the same time as the violent uprising in Jamaica, and was eventually given royal assent on the 7th of June 1832. This was a pivotal moment for those who had fought for emancipation for so long.
So some West Indian MPs are members of Parliament for rotten boroughs, essentially bought seats in Parliament. And one of the effects of the 1832 Reform Bill is to change this system. And it means that after 1832 there are far fewer, or at least significantly fewer, West Indian MPs in Parliament. And of course what I mean by a West Indian MP is a member of that West India interest, a planter or a merchant deriving a large share of their income from properties in the Caribbean. And so that group is much less of a parliamentary powerhouse than it had previously been by the time that Parliament is debating finally full emancipation in the 1830s.
The abolitionists were now in a position of unrivalled strength. They had removed the final obstacle in the way of emancipation, the vicious presence of the West India lobby in Parliament. The third and final pillar had fallen.
By 1833, emancipation was inevitable. Lord Grey's decision to call yet another election in 1832, which led to an extended Whig majority in Parliament, had all but ensured this. The question was who would take responsibility for proposing this bill. The Prime Minister's eldest son, Henry Grey, had been working tirelessly alongside Viscount Goderich for some time on drafting an emancipation bill. But Charles Grey had different ideas. Both Henry and Goderich were far too radical for his liking, and so he turned to his trusted colonial secretary, the Earl of Derby, Edward Stanley. A rising star in the political sphere, Stanley was a more attractive candidate in terms of retaining the support of the moderate Whigs and Liberal Tories, not only for the bill, but also for the Whig government in general. He was admittedly one of the most conservative of Grey's ministers, and his approach to drafting a slave emancipation bill would certainly reflect this fact.
On a Tuesday evening, on the 14th of May 1833, Edward Stanley rose in the House. The chamber was full. His ministerial proposition for the emancipation of slaves had been preceded by a great deal of boisterous and unruly behaviour. But once the chamber quietened down, Stanley proceeded.
Sir, I feel most anxious on account of the responsibility which devolves upon me. I feel not only that our maritime commerce is here concerned, but that the interests, the comforts, the prosperity, perhaps I might say the very existence of a large population in the West India colonies, depending upon us for support and protection, hang upon the decision of those resolutions which it will be my duty to submit to the House. Nor can I conceal from myself the immense influence on the population of foreign countries which must arise from the result of the mighty experiment which we now propose to make. Besides all these things, there is enough to make any man, the strongest, the boldest, and the best, shrink in some degree under the weight of so great a responsibility.
So Stanley, the colonial secretary, introduces the Emancipation Bill finally into Parliament in 1833, and one of the things he says about it is that it's a mighty experiment in his words, because of course the colonies had always run as plantation colonies using slave labour. So what's being proposed here is a significant change, and that's one of the reasons I think that he describes this as a mighty experiment. What he knows that he's introducing is a significant social transformation in the Caribbean colonies.
And so, on that late spring evening, it was officially announced that as of the 1st of August 1834, slavery would be abolished in the British dominions. The title of property in man would no longer be recognised in British law. There were, however, two major caveats. The first was that the enslaved population would be free in name only, under a system of apprenticeship in the colonies for 12 years. The second was that slaveholders, and not the enslaved, would be compensated for the loss of their property.
There are two other elements to the Emancipation Bill of 1833. One is an apprenticeship scheme, a so-called apprenticeship scheme, which effectively kept enslaved people working as they had as slaves for a full 4 years after the Emancipation Bill comes into effect. The other is compensation, which really recognises the slaveholders' arguments about slavery and property. Slaveholders had argued throughout this process that to end slavery would essentially, in their view, be to rob them of what they called their property, enslaved people. And the compensation part of the bill recognises the validity of that claim and essentially pays them off for the freedom of enslaved people. And so it's a really important part of the bill, and it helps in the sense that a number of MPs who are slaveholders are willing to vote for this bill. But I think more importantly, it's the part of the bill that allows for colonial legislatures to reluctantly, begrudgingly accept the reality that they need to ratify this legislation, and they do. You know, where there is a legislature, it passes through the colonial legislature in Jamaica, in Barbados. Compensation is the way that that's done. That's how the wheels of this piece of legislation are oiled, and it's how it becomes possible to get it through. Essentially, the planters are bought off.
After the £15 million loan was increased to a one-off grant of £20 million, equating to 40% of the British government's annual budget at the time, and equal to roughly £17 billion in today's money, only the most pragmatic of abolitionists avoided a feeling of utter anathema at the prospect. Even if providing compensation was the only practical way of emancipating those in the Caribbean, it was in itself an acceptance that slaves were property that could be bought off. This went against all that they had campaigned against for decades. After voting for compensation in order to push emancipation through, Thomas Buxton exclaimed, "I did it only to save bloodshed. That was my motive."
The bill that gets agreed in 1833 is the process of really intensive negotiations, and ultimately it is a compromise between government, between abolitionists, and between the West India interest. And many abolitionists are disappointed with elements of it, including the compensation clause. And it's significant that the one group, of course, that is left out of these negotiations are enslaved people themselves. So the compensation effectively is the government, the British public, taxpayers, paying slaveholders for emancipation. And absolutely it goes against the central tenets of the abolitionist argument. Because what was the central tenet of the abolitionist argument, where it all starts in 1787, is, am I not a man and a brother? And the Emancipation Bill of 1833, whilst it concedes many of those abolitionist arguments and accepts them as persuasive, still treats enslaved people in some way as though they were property.
Whatever those in the abolitionist camp thought of the grant, it was almost certainly upon this basis that King William IV, a firm opponent of emancipation, finally approved the bill. On the 28th of August 1833, an Act for the abolition of slavery in the British colonies was given royal assent. Of the 12 men who had founded the Society for effecting the abolition of the slave trade, only one had survived to see the whole institution collapse, a certain Thomas Clarkson. His close ally and linchpin of the abolition movement, William Wilberforce, had sadly died just a month before the act was given royal assent, although upon his deathbed he was undoubtedly secure in the knowledge that emancipation was to occur in the near future. It had been a long and hard battle for abolitionists. As in the run-up to the ratification of the 1807 Abolition Act, abolitionists who sought to end the entire institution of slavery met fierce opposition on both sides of the Atlantic. To terminate the slave trade was one thing, but to end an institution in which so many people had invested so much in every sense of the word would be to utterly ruin what had once been the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The challenge may have been greater, but the arguments and evidence abolitionists had at their disposal were equally powerful. The West Indian colonies were now a stain and a burden upon the metropole, both morally and financially, and Britain had set its sights elsewhere in the East Indies. Ties between the West Indian colonies and Britain were also becoming increasingly strained. This was not helped by events in Jamaica in 1831 and the brutal backlash that unearthed the true nature of the planter, who could no longer play the victim.
Nonetheless, as was the case in 1807, abolitionists also required an element of good fortune and timing. The split in the Tory party allowed a Whig government to rise to power, one determined to see slaves emancipated, and one that controlled an overwhelming majority after the Great Reform Act was passed.
Finally, those who called for emancipation had to be pragmatic. If change was ever to occur, judging by the years of disappointment and opposition and delay, concessions had to be made in the form of compensation, no matter the burden upon the nation's conscience.
I suppose one question to think about is how might emancipation, as it was decided by Parliament in 1833, have looked from the perspective of enslaved people in the colonies? And we know something about that because, of course, there are all sorts of documents and sources about the kinds of celebrations, for example, that accompany the Emancipation Bill and full emancipation, which finally comes in 1838 after the end of the apprenticeship system. But there are all sorts of ongoing legacies of the institution that we also need to think about even after this very long drawn process of emancipation is finished.